Welcome back. Well, it's been a long wait for families after years of criticism and political pressure. Today, a shocking report was released into obstetrics and gynaecology at the Mackay Hospital. The report was compiled after more than 80 women were interviewed about the long-lasting physical and psychological harm they received, substandard care impacting recovery. Some of this goes back 10 years. The horror report devastatingly confirmed 3 cases where inadequate care at the hospital led to the loss of a child. It's a shocking indictment on the state of Queensland's health services. And joining us now, Leader of the Queensland Opposition, David Crisafulli. David, I want to get on to some other issues, but let's start with this devastating report about the Mackay Hospital. 80 women involved, 3 dead babies that we know of. Apology this morning, Shaw, from the Minister. You've been in Mackay today. What's been the reaction of locals?
Oh, they're heartbroken, Peter. This is the biggest catastrophic failure of Queensland Health in nearly 20 years since the Jayant Patel saga in Bundaberg. And to see the devastation on the faces of those young mums today is something I'll never forget. I met a young woman in her mid-20s who's had to have a hysterectomy because of a botched surgery. She'll never have kids again. Another who's incontinent, and she only found out about this through the media. No one's contacted her. I watched the government's press conference today and there was just no accountability. No accountability from the Minister. It's everybody else's fault. And it's as though that the death of 3 innocent babies and dozens of women whose lives will never be the same just don't matter to them. And I've got bad news for the government. We are going to continue to pursue this until every single one of them get the justice they deserve and until someone is held accountable in this government for the most catastrophic of failures.
Yeah, just on that point, I remember politics when it used to be that the buck stopped with someone we elected. But for the last, 10 or so years, particularly at a state level, it's never anyone's fault. We saw that litany of ministers sit there at the Code Inquiry after 800 Victorians were killed. I can't remember, I have no recollection, all that sort of weasel word language. Surely voters who pay for all of this deserve governments and politicians who take responsibility.
Well, that's the way Westminster has to operate, and yet it doesn't, and certainly not in Queensland. And I'll make this point. I don't think that ignorance is ever a defence, but in this case, the Minister can't even plead that. It's nearly 12 months to the day since myself and our Shadow Health spokesperson, Ros Bates, went into that community and these brave women stood up in a hall in front of strangers and told their stories. We took that back to Parliament and we explained chapter and verse what was happening there. The government accused us of making up stories. The Premier said we were scaremongering, and they just delayed and delayed and delayed until eventually the pressure became too much and they ordered this inquiry. And yet somehow no one can accept responsibility, even though they attempted to cover it up for a year. It is absolutely disgraceful and it is a catastrophic failure, and someone has to be held accountable.
Let's go to this issue of tax, this property tax grab. I mean, controversial to say the least. I've never seen anything like it anywhere in tax policy in all my years. The Premier today has been forced to back down. She had these, again, weasel words. She tried to make a joke about the state of origin, but they've had to dump the policy. Her language, though, seemed to suggest that she's passed on it for the moment, but she's not ruling out trying to get it up. The only issue here was state and territory governments refused to give her the data in order to tax people. Were you surprised it's gone?
They just don't get it. They just don't understand that in the middle of the biggest housing crisis, that if you slug investors and make investing less desirable, that somehow that doesn't flow through to renters. And from day one, when they introduced this, our Shadow Treasurer, David Janetsky, called it out. from day one as a renter's tax, because ultimately it gets passed down to the person who can least afford it. Now, the absurdity today was the Premier, exactly as you said, ducking and weaving and blaming everybody else. But what was really laid bare was the arrogance and the belligerence of the Treasurer, who effectively said, that's the Premier's decision, I stand by it. So you've got two of the most senior ministers in the government now at warfare. And interestingly, I was speaking to one of your co-hosts, Peta Credlin, who was explaining this and describing it in a catalogue as big as the Melbourne Cup. This is the worst week this government has had. When you see the myriad of fires that are burning, we have a forensic lab inquiry that shows that innocent people were denied justice. We've had Olympians and Paralympians snubbed by the Premier not using the word Paralympics in a title. We've had this energy debacle where there's been absolutely no plan whatsoever. And now to see this, the way that this tax unfolded, the government is just a shambles at the moment, Peter. And unfortunately, everyday Queenslanders who just want to know they've got a world-class health system, that they've got laws that can protect them. And we've seen the failings in our youth crime system laid bare this week with an innocent father killed. It's a shambles at the moment. And that's what happens when government's at war. That's what happens when there's no agenda. And that's what happens when a Premier is just basically checked out.
There's not much I could disagree with there. David Crisafulli, thank you.